So today we're going to talk about a new type of iteration. We are going to be using a for loop. For loops are another type of iteration or repetition. In this case, we have a variable that we want to increase or decrease each time we move through the code. So we are going to create a program that blinks one LED at a time across the row at the top, and then moves down to the next row, and then moves across that one, and then down to the next row and moves across that one, and all the way across until we have blinked every single one of the LEDs on the microbit. So take a minute and brainstorm the steps that will be needed to move the light across the first row and then down to the second row. So just start with our first row and down to the second. And think about what are the steps that the program needs to do to plot and unplot an LED in the first section, and then to the next one, and then to the next one, and then down. I do want to make a note that this program is not the same as the one where we moved the sprite with the move block. This one is a little bit more complicated, and we use it for different things. And so we need to use the plot LED block instead. So you should have something that looks kind of like this, right? So what are we doing? We are turning the LED on at 0, 0, and then we are turning it off. Then we are turning on the LED at 1, 0, then we are turning it off. Then we're turning on the LED at 2, 0, turning it off. So what are we doing? We're doing this across the entire row. So what is changing in this series of pseudocode? Right? If we look at what the variable is, we go from 0, 0 to 1, 0 to 2, 0 to 3, 0 to 4, 0. So the position, the X position of the lit LED is what is changing as we move through the program. Now, what do we call something that changes in a program? It's a variable. And what are we doing to this X-axis variable? We're adding to it. Okay, so we're adding 1 to that variable each time. Let's just say we want to press the A button on the microbit. And when we do that, the LEDs will blink across the top row to the end. So let's focus on this top row. We will start by plotting the LED at 0, 0, and then unplot it. We then want to increase the X variable by 1 so that the LED plots 1, 0, and then unplots. Then we want to repeat this until we have 2, 0 as the X variable, and then 3, 0, 3, 0 as the X variable, and then 4, 0 as the X variable. So this is our pseudocode, right? We have our pseudocode, our input, and our output. We also need a variable to accomplish this. Notice that our variable is changing in value, not position. This means that we are going to have a number variable rather than a sprite variable. We also need a name for the variable. Now, since it's moving across the row in the X direction, I am going to name mine X. So first thing, we need a variable. So create one called X. Remember to go into the variables toolbox, create a variable, and I just named mine X. Since we want the LED 0, 0 to be our starting point, we want to set that X variable to be 0. So bring out a set variable block and keep that value at 0. We said to our program we were going to start with the press A button, so also bring out the A button pressed input block. And then we are going to plot, excuse me. This time we need a program to plot the X variable into the X equals 0 position. So bring out a plot XY block from the LED toolbox and put an X variable button in for X. So it comes out with plot 0, 0. In the plot x 0, we are going to put plot x as the x variable because that's what we want to change. So once we plot the x variable in the 0 position, we want it to go out. So we need to unplot it. Bring out an unplot XY block from the LED toolbox. We have learned several times now that computers like to rush through things as fast as they can. So let's go ahead and add in a pause block between the plot and the unplot. And we'll just head that off before we even get it started. So press the A button, and what do you see? You should see that 0, 0 block, or not block, that 0, 0 LED light up and then go out. So now we want our LED to move over to the x equals 1. So we need to add 1 to the x variable. So up here on set, we set it equal to 0. If we want it to now be 1, we have to add to that. This is what the for loop does. It takes the variable that you choose and adds 1 to it just automatically. That's just what it does. So bring out a for block from the loops menu. Notice the red index here. This is an automatic variable that is sometimes used in programming when we want to count something. Since we want to count the x position, and we have created a variable for that, we want to change that to the x variable. So click on the little drop down and choose the x variable from the list. If you don't see it in the little drop down, you can go to the variables menu and drag the little x over into that spot. So how many iterations is this code going to go through? The program is going to increase the value of the x variable by 1 until the program goes through 4 repetitions. Then it will exit the loop and move on to the next thing. So press the A button and see if your LED blinks on and off as it moves across the top row. Remember, we want our program to blink the LED across the top row. Then move to the next row and blink across. Then move down a row and blink across, all the way to the end. Take a minute to think about what we are going to need to do to get it to go down in a column. If you said we need to increase the Y position, you are absolutely correct. We not only need to count the X position, but the Y position as well. Go into the variables toolbox and create a new variable called Y. Now, how did we count the X variable? We put it into a for loop. We can do the same thing with the Y variable. The code we have right now moves the LED across the row by changing the X variable by 1. What is the value of the Y coordinate this whole time? Y equals 0. If we want to go to the second row, Y needs to equal 1, which means we need to add 1 to our 0 when we get to the end of the row. So our pseudocode starts with the Y variable equaling 0 and X equals 0. The code adds 1 to X and keeps Y at 0 for 4 iterations until X equals 4. And then it goes back to the top of that loop, and now X is 0 again. So when we get to 4, we want to exit that loop and add 1 to Y. So can you guess how we might be able to do that? If you said we need to increase the Y position, you are absolutely correct. We not only need to count the X position, but the Y position as well. So let's go into the variables toolbox and create a new variable called Y. Now, how did we count the X variable? We put it into a for loop. We can do the same thing with the Y variable. The code we have right now moves the LED across the row by changing the X variable by 1. What is the value of the y coordinate this whole time? It's y equals 0. If we want to go to the second row, y needs to equal 1, which means we need to add 1 when we get to the end of the row. So our pseudocode starts with the y variable equaling 0 and x equaling 0. The code adds 1 to x and keeps y at 0. Then it adds 1 to x, keeping y at 0. Then x equals 3, and then x equals 4. This whole time, y is equaling 0. When we get to 4, we want to exit that loop, and we want to add 1 to y. Then we want the entire thing to repeat until the LED gets to the end of the second row. We want this to continue until the LED gets to the bottom row where y equals 4. Can you guess how we might be able to do that? Remember our nested loops from the other day. We have 2 different repetitions here, so we need 2 different loops. Bring out another for loop from the loops toolbox. We want the x variable counted first, so its loop will go inside the loop for the y variable. Press A and see what happens. Something is wrong. Look closely at the code that we have right here. Can you guess what it is? Look at the plot XY block. What are we plotting? We are plotting the x variable as it changes, but we are keeping the y coordinate at 0. So on the plot and unplot blocks, we need to change that y to the y variable. So go into your variables menu and click on your little y variable and drag it into that spot instead of 0. So now what we have is we have plot xy. We're plotting the variables instead of specific numbers. So once you have this done, share your project and add that link into Classroom. So your B assignment is to add to your program so that the LED moves down the first column. So each light down the first column moves over to the next column and moves down one at a time, and then moves over to the next column and down one at a time. This can be on the same program, so you can just press the B button instead of creating a new program for this one. For your A assignment, you do want a new program for this one. You want to create a program that erases an icon as the LED moves across the icon. So as the LED moves, when the A button is pressed, you want it to just very one at a time erase the icon.